Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and this week we're going to be talking about Blue-Green Infect. It's a combo deck that's also an aggro deck that's also sort of a tempo deck. So one of the things that makes this deck different than almost every other deck, one, is that you're playing Infect creatures, right? You want to get in early, and you want to get unblocked creatures through, and you just want to make sure that your opponent doesn't kill them. So it's very much similar to the decks like Rug Delver and Blue-Red Delver in that you're playing a Protect the Queen strategy again. But this deck offers combo kills, and it can win as early as turn 2, which is rare, but it can, and it has a lot of nuance in the attack steps. So there's a lot of really cool interactions with this deck, and I want to kind of help you navigate through and find out how to play this deck properly. So, the key cards in this deck are obviously Glistener Elf, Bladed Agent, Invigorate, Berserk. Oh, Berserk, come on. And cards like Vines of Vastwood and Scale Up. Obviously, in the early turns for a deck like this, the main thing that you want to be doing is playing a creature. So this is a tempo deck. You want to get a creature down early, and you want to be able to attack in with it. So you're going to be playing either Noble Hierarch, Glistener Elf, or a Inkmoth Nexus very early in the game and getting that ready to attack. So your opening hand, you're going to want to have one of those three cards. Hopefully one of the two Infect cards, but possibly you have a Bladed Agent for a turn 2 play. And those your main killers are those three cards: Inkmoth Nexus, Bladed Agent, and Glistener Elf. Sometimes you'll play a Green Sun Zenith and maybe a Viridian Corruptor. I like to do that myself because it gets around stuff like Chalice of the Void, which your deck is not super soft to, but it can be a pain in the butt, so sometimes you want to get rid of something like that. Also, just sometimes you want to get rid of a Batterskull or something like that that is blocking the way for your guys. So, whereas you're not worried about your opponent's life gain per se, you might just be worried about their blockers, and having a way to get rid of their construct token or whatnot is a nice little thing to have in the main deck. I like to play 13 creatures in my Infect deck. So, instance-wise, obviously you're playing the classic cantrip suite of Ponder and Brainstorm. Sometimes you'll play 2 to 3 Ponders and 4 Brainstorms because you have a lot of other stuff that's going on with this deck. You can't just put all these slots into all this air, right? Air is in draw spells, right? So, of course, you're playing Force of Will. Of course, you're playing Daze. You might be playing a combination of 7 total of those 2 cards. You might be playing 8. I like to scale back 1 Force of Will and put it in the board because I'd like a little bit more interaction. Then you're playing cards like Vines of Vastwood, which is a great protection spell, but also can work as a pump spell. And Crop Rotation is a really great card in this deck too, because it allows you to have a couple of cool slots in your board, but also allows you to get around Wasteland and go get another Inkmoth Nexus if your opponent decides that that's how they want to get rid of your Inkmoth Nexus. So that's a really great way to slow down your opponent as well. So let's talk about the early turns of the game. You're going to want to be playing a Inkmoth Nexus or a Bladed Agent on turn 1. Possibly a Noble Hierarch. So you want to have one of those 3 cards in your opening hand, and hopefully you also have a colored mana source that does green and blue, hopefully, and you want to have a Brainstorm or a Ponder, just so you can get a little bit of selection, maybe be able to see more lands and spells, right? So on your turn 2 is really when things start to happen for you. You're going to be probably attacking for your first time, and what happens a lot of times is you go into your attack step, and your opponent will try and kill your creature immediately. So if they bolt it, great, you have Invigorate. That lines up perfectly, that creature's still in play, and now your opponent has taken 5 damage, right? 5 Infect damage. It's half his life total, right there, right? What if you Invigorated and then you Berserked? That's game. You've won the game right there. Rare, but it does happen occasionally. So, if you're playing against a deck that hits your opponent, hits your creature during, like, before they've taken damage, they stand to take a lot more damage. So most people will like to wait until after damage happens to try and kill the creature, because they don't want you to react with a pump spell. If they if they don't know that, they find out very quickly that it's a bad idea to try and kill the creature while it's attacking or before the attack step. So, a lot of times what will happen is they'll try and kill your creature at the end of after damage has been dealt. They'll try and kill your creature at the end of your turn to tap you out. That's when Vines of Vastwood, and sometimes you have to save your creature with Invigorate. That happens. Or Daze. If you can counter it, if you can counter a spell like this against a deck that's creature reactive with Lightning Bolts and Swords of Plowshares, you're better off countering that and saving your pump spells for the attack step, right? So, going into your attack step when you have something like Noble Hierarch in play, if you can get your creature to be bigger than whatever interaction they're using, some people will just play like a Dark Blast on your creature or something like that. Gut Shot, let's say. And it's very easy for you to be like, well, now you've got to deal with it. I got Noble Hierarch out. You've got to deal with it before the attack step. And they're like, okay, well, I'm going to try and kill your creature. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to cast a Invigorate or whatever. The whole thing, it's all about sequencing this stuff on the stack and knowing how many spells your opponent can cast to interact with your creatures. And a lot of times, it starts out as a combo deck and becomes a tempo deck where you're definitely playing Protect the Queen over the course of a few turns to just get it in. And then once your opponent has run out of resources or blockers, that's when you go full force. Sometimes you're just chipping in for 1-2 damage a turn and they just can't deal with it, and there you go, you've won the game that way. Luckily, a lot of your threats have evasion, so Blighted Agent can't be blocked, and your Inkmoth Nexus has flying, so that's really, both those are really good as far as getting in damage. One thing you do have to worry about is artifact removal is live against this deck, because your Inkmoth Nexus is so easily targeted by stuff like a Braid, Meltdown, Meltdown is, I think, a sorcery, right? I'm pretty sure Meltdown's a sorcery, but stuff like that is how they kill your Inkmoth Nexus. So let's talk about the mid game. In the mid game, you're trying to make sure that your threats are still on the board, and you're getting in for 1-2 damage a turn. If you've made it to the mid game, it means that your opponent probably had an interaction in the first couple of turns of the game, and they either were able to remove one of your threats, or you were playing conservatively enough that they weren't able to kill your guys, but they didn't lose either, right? So the next thing you're going to want to do is kind of go wide. You don't want to go too wide because stuff like board wipes exist, but you're already kind of soft at that to begin with because you have Noble Hierarch. So Noble Hierarch is a creature that's just going to be sitting on the board doing nothing a lot of times. And you have a little bit of resiliency against that with Inkmoth Nexus, because if your opponent kills all your board, you still have Inkmoth Nexus, maybe even crop rotation into an Inkmoth Nexus to get that going, right? So in the mid game, you want to make sure that your opponent is low on resources as far as cards in hand are concerned, and you're able to get an idea of what's in their hand. Back in the day, this was great. You had the Caxian Probe, and you could just see what's in their hand. Maybe you play Peek. You can try Peek. Peek's not a bad idea, but it's not played often, right? So the idea here is you want to make sure that you have the nut hand against whatever interaction your opponent has. So if you know that they have Swords of Plowshares, you want to have Vines of Vastwood. If you think that they have counter magic, you want to have your own counter magic. Or maybe you just have another pump spell, right? At the end of the day, what you don't want to do is cast Berserk and then have your creature killed, because that's going to waste at least 3 cards, right? Because you probably have pumped the creature already and then Berserked, trying to go for the win, and your opponent's like, no, just swords that. And you're like, okay, I don't have anything else I can do. Shutting the door. Shutting the door is the mid game with this deck. There is no go long with this deck. You have to just chip in the mid game and try and get there that way. There's not a like, oh, hopefully I can draw my fatty at the end of the game and close out with that. You're running early. You're a combo deck, and you need to treat your deck as though it is a combo deck with a lot of resiliency against other combo decks and decks that don't use as many creatures. Your worst nightmare are decks like Burn that can interact with your creature constantly, but you do have the pump spells that kind of stop that. And decks that are playing Solitude and Force of Will. They're really hard to interact with as far as those decks are concerned. So, one of the really cool features that you've just recently gotten your hands on is Mindlink Mech. If you put Mindlink Mech into play, it has a crew of 1, and it basically gains Infect whenever you crew it, right? So that's a really great card, and it would then have flying. Most likely, if you had Inkmoth Nexus, or if you had Blighted Agent, right? One of the things to keep in mind is that it's also not great against artifact removal. So, sideboard. Let's talk about sideboard. There are a couple different ways you can run the sideboard. Some people like to play Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, Sylvan Library. Some people will splash in white and maybe even main deck Teferi Time Raveler so that there's no interaction on your turn, which is a fine card to play. And then you can play stuff like Swords to Plowshares in the board. You gotta have, obviously, you've got to have your graveyard interaction, Surgical Extraction, maybe a Fairy Macabre. Force of Vigor is great in this deck. You know, obviously, you're green deck, so you should be playing at least 1 or 2 Force of Vigors. Flusterstorm is great, especially if you're doing a lot of stuff on the stack. You can just be like, okay, you know what? I win the game because I'm just going to Flusterstorm and cast Berserk. Endurance is also a great sideboard card against graveyards. So, that's Infect. It's a deck that has a lot of nuance. You're playing on the stack a lot. And it's one of those decks that just nobody seems to be completely ready for, and they haven't tested it very much. So I think that if you choose a deck like this, it's just really great to run at bigger events because people don't exactly know what they're playing against. Hey, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out this other video, and if you can, please support us on Patreon.com.